Fellas, in the last two UFC pay-per-views, we've had two new Australian champions with Alexander Volkanovski and Jack Della Maddalena. I don't care what the UFC schedule is. We need to go back to Perth this year. The UFC need to do a pay-per-view in Perth. Probably going to be either August or September time this year, but the UFC have to do a pay-per-view in Australia. So I'm going to be building that UFC Australia pay-per-view, considering that JDM just beat Bilal Muhammad to become the welterweight champion. I'm going to try and make it stacked. A good Australian card. I'm not trying to make it UFC 312, but I'm also going to keep it realistic. Australian fighters on the card. It's not going to be UFC 300 Part 2, but a stacked Australia pay-per-view for UFC, probably going to be 319 later on this year. And to kick off the card, we've got Junior Tafa. I know he's never a great look when you've got Junior Tafa for kicking off the card, but he's from New Zealand. Let's have him on the card. Now put him against Ryan Spann. I can see this being one of those fights where it's so low level that it's actually kind of a fun fight to see. Both of these guys, I'm surprised they're both still in the UFC. Junior Tafa has been losing on a consistent basis, and every time he does win, he looks awful doing so, but at least he goes out there and swings for the first round of the fight until he gasses out. And Ryan Spann, since moving up to the heavyweight division, looked awful. He got destroyed by Waldo Cortez Acosta earlier on this year. Loser gets cut from the UFC, but it's a chance for Junior Tafa to pick up a win in front of the Australian fans against Ryan Spann, who needs to step down in competition in the heavyweight division. Loser gets cut from the UFC. If Junior Tafa wins, he's won in front of the Aussie fans, stays in the UFC. So Junior Tafa, Ryan Spann, let's get it done for Australia. You've got to have one of the Tafa bros on an Australian pay-per-view, so I feel like Junior Tafa could be the guy to do it. Anyway, next fight, we've got George Mangos coming over to the UFC to debut as he takes on Austin Bashi. Now, George Mangos, if you don't know who he is, he's been killing it on the regional scene. He's 7-0, undefeated, every single one of his wins by finish, most of them coming in the first round as well. Champion on the local scene. I don't know how the UFC haven't picked this guy up yet. He's an absolute beast on the regional scene. And I feel like an Australian pay-per-view is the pay-per-view where you get George Mangos into the UFC as he takes on Austin Bashi, who's also in a similar position to George Mangos. This guy was on a massive winning streak on the regional scene with a bunch of finishes, comes over to the UFC after the Contender Series and gets beaten by Christian Rodriguez. So this is kind of a fight between two kind of prospects. One guy that's came from the Contender Series, one guy that's still on the regional scene. If you're going to debut in the UFC, I think now's the time to do it on an Australian pay-per-view. George Mangos has a really good chance of beating Austin Bashi as well because he's a submission artist, and obviously Austin Bashi is a heavy grappler too. So Austin Bashi versus George Mangos, two young, hungry guys. One guy who's competed in the UFC and fell short. One guy from the regional scene. Getting an Australian prospect in the UFC in front of the Australian crowd. Don't get him on the Contender Series. Get him straight to the UFC on UFC 319 in Australia. George Mangos, Austin Bashi. I think that's a good fight for the featherweight division to kind of build the name of whoever wins, and obviously it's on a pay-per-view as well. Next fight, one of Australia's best prospects right now, Quinlan Salkild, is going to be taking on Jai Herbert, or at least that's the fight I think should be made next for Quinlan. Quinlan Salkild debuted in Australia early this year at 312, and he went out there and just knocked out Anshul Jubilee in 19 seconds. Great way to debut in the UFC. Seems like a bit of a character as well. This guy could potentially go far in the lightweight division, even on the regional scene. He's got very, very slick boxing like a lot of these Australians do. Very slick fighter. I can see him going far in the lightweight division, and considering just knocked out Anshul Jubilee, you've got to have him on the pay-per-view against Jai Herbert, who's actually a pretty technical striker. Too technical for his own good because he always ends up being a staring contest, and the guy's one of the most inconsistent fighters in the UFC. Still surprised he's actually still got his UFC contract, but I think to give Quinlan Salkild a go highlight reel win, Jai Herbert could be the guy. I can see this being a really good competitive stand-up fight. It's obviously a step up in competition for Salkild, because even though that Jai Herbert is a very inconsistent fighter, he's not awful. You know, he's kind of got that Leon Edwards-esque style where he's overly technical, not got the best finishing ability, doesn't really take the most risks. And I feel like it's a good fight to kind of test the striking and also let Quinlan Salkild showcase in front of the Australian fans. So Quinlan Salkild versus Jai Herbert on UFC 319. I'd lean towards Salkild winning this fight, honestly, by some sort of decision, maybe a late stoppage, but I think it's a good technical striking matchup at 155. Step down for Jai Herbert against a young, hungry Quinlan Salkild. Let's get the fight done. And then Navajo Sterling just won recently on the same card as Della Maddalena from New Zealand, undefeated in the UFC. I think he's undefeated as a professional too, and I already match made him yesterday against Ian Q Talaba, so this would be the fight I would do. Navajo Sterling versus Ian Q Talaba. He's 2-0 in the UFC's Navajo Sterling from New Zealand, trains out of that City Kickboxing gym with the likes of Adesanya and everyone from there, but he hasn't really put the nail in his performances yet. He still needs to get that big win, in my opinion. He's not really looked absolutely amazing in both of his wins in the UFC, and I want to see how he does against a guy like Ian Q Talaba, who's not going to let him be complacent. Ian Q Talaba is going to put on the pace, he's going to put the pressure on him, and he's going to really force him into a dogfight. It's a step up in competition, the perfect fight to test Navajo Sterling in the UFC, but I also would lean towards Navajo Sterling winning this fight in front of the Australian fans. So Navajo Sterling to go 3-0 in the UFC, 3 wins in 2025 against Ian Q Talaba. That's the fight I would do for Navajo Sterling. And then Jimmy Crute. I mean, the guy just was on the main card of a pay-per-view early this year in UFC 312, so I feel like you've kind of got to have him on the card, even though he's obviously not going to be anywhere near the main card on this card. I'd put him against Ivan Erslan, who also competed last weekend against Navajo Sterling. Again, one of these fights where the loser gets cut from the UFC. Jimmy Crute was at once a big prospect in light heavyweight, but now he's just been not performing. He's been on a... Well, he's lost 3 of his last... Well, he had lost 3 of his last 4 fights, and then he fought early this year against Rodolfo Bellato, and he had a draw with him. And I think that was a perfect scorecard. I did think it was a draw. And the fact that Ivan Erslan's 0-2 in the UFC, he desperately needs a win, so this is kind of like a contract saver for both of these guys, but I could see it being a good fight. Jimmy Crute went out there and threw the kitchen sink out there in the first round against Rodolfo Bellato before he gassed out, and that's kind of a similar style to Ivan Erslan, who likes to swing and, you know, swing for the fences in both of his fights, so I can see this being an early stoppage. 2 guys that are pressure heavy, 2 guys that swing for the fences. I could see a finish in this fight. The loser gets cut from the UFC, and I would lean towards Jimmy Crute winning this one. I'm not entirely sure if Ivan Erslan's UFC worthy, so it could just be a free win to Jimmy Crute in front of the Australian fans, which is a much needed win because he hasn't won in years. So I'd do Jimmy Crute versus Ivan Erslan. I think it'd be a fun fight. Builds the name of Jimmy Crute against Ivan Erslan. I think he's got everything to be a decent fight for the prelims. And also Jake Matthews was on the main card in the last Australian pay-per-view too at UFC 312. I'd do Jake Matthews versus Santiago Ponzinibbio. I think this could be a good fight, a step up for Jake Matthews in the welterweight division. He won at UFC 312 against Francisco Prado. Didn't really do anything notable in that fight. He's not really a highlight reel type of fight. It's a heavy decision machine. But I put him against a fun striker in Santiago Ponzinibbio, who's a bit of a kill or be killed guy. Half the times he's on the opposite end of a highlight reel, it's him getting knocked out. The other half, it's him knocking somebody else out. So I feel like Santiago Ponzinibbio, who's just been knocked out by D-Rod. A good bounce-back fight could be Jake Matthews. I would lean towards Ponzinibbio winning this fight, but if Jake Matthews was to win, well, he's won in front of the Australian crowds, and considering he just won on an Australian pay-per-view, I feel like you've got to have him on again. So for the prelims, Jake Matthews versus Santiago Ponzinibbio should be a pretty fun striking matchup. I can see Ponzinibbio making it fun because he ends up, well, he's usually in fun fights. So Matthews, Ponzinibbio for the prelims. And then we've got Drew Dober. I think this fight could potentially be fight of the night. Drew Dober against Tom Nolan. Yeah, this would be an absolute banger at 155. Tom Nolan has been in bangers since his UFC debut. The guy goes out there and swings for the fences, puts up a scrap every single time. He recently had an absolutely amazing performance at UFC 312 in Australia early this year against Borshev, where he beat the crap out of Borshev in an amazing fight. He goes out there and he's always having fun fights, and that's similar to Drew Dober as well. Drew Dober is the definition of a kill or be killed fighter. He's either putting people to sleep or is getting put to sleep himself. He's like a walking highlight reel in the 155-pound division. So I think for Tom Nolan, we give him a step up in competition in front of Australia on the prelims, quite high up on the prelims, against a well-known name who's, you know, used to fun fights in Drew Dober. I think this could be fight of the night potential, an absolute banger for the prelims in Australia, whilst also helping build the name of Tom Nolan. And at this point, I probably would favour Tom Nolan to beat Drew Dober because of how Drew Dober has been performing recently. So to build the name of Tom Nolan, get him in there against Drew Dober, and I think it will be an amazing fight of the night. Probably doesn't go the distance. So for Tom Nolan, give him Drew Dober. And then for the prelim headliner, Ikram Aliskerov is going to be taking on Jacob Malkoun. Now, if you don't know Jacob Malkoun, he's kind of been going under the radar compared to a lot of the rest of the Australian fighters. He has been a bit of a win-loss fighter in the UFC, but he's actually pretty talented is Jacob Malkoun. He's got decent grappling, decent takedown defense. He's a hard hitter as well in the middleweight division. So for Jacob Malkoun, I'd get him in front of Australia. He's been out for quite some time, and I'd put him in there against Ikram Aliskerov, one of middleweight's best prospects from Russia, and you're going to be seeing kind of a bit of a theme between Russians versus Australians in this card. So I thought we'd get Ikram on the card. Again, another dangerous striker similar to Jacob Malkoun. I don't see this one going the distance, and I think you can promise the winner of this fight somebody in the top 15 in the middleweight division. You might think this is a bit of a step down for Ikram Aliskerov. You beat Andre Muniz and then you get Jacob Malkoun, but I think if you promise the winner somebody in the top 15, it has high implications. And I think Jacob Malkoun, listen, never count him out. You can't count him out against Ikram Aliskerov. He has got heavy hands. He is a pretty decent striker in himself. He could get the job done against Ikram Aliskerov. And the last time Ikram Aliskerov fought an Australian fighter, he got knocked the fuck out. So for the prelim headliner, winner gets a fight in the top 15 in the middleweight division. Ikram Aliskerov takes on Jacob Malkoun to get Jacob Malkoun in front of Australia against a fairly well-known middleweight prospect. That would be the headliner of the prelims. And to kick off the main card, I'm going to have Bryce Mitchell against Chepe Mariscal. Now, if you don't know who Chepe Mariscal is, this dude's been going massively under the radar at 145. 5-0 in the UFC, undefeated in the UFC. He has actually fought Bryce Mitchell back in 2017, and he lost a decision, but I feel like now's the perfect time to run it back. Chepe Mariscal fights like Sean Strickland talks. Like, Sean Strickland's always talking about going into a war. That is how Chepe Mariscal fights. He throws out the kitchen sink in every fight. He's always in dogfights. One of the funnest guys in the featherweight division, and I'm surprised nobody's really talking about him. We need to get him on a pay-per-view, in my opinion, and I think a main card of a pay-per-view against Bryce Mitchell. Everybody knows Bryce Mitchell, one of the bigger names in the featherweight division because of his controversial takes, and obviously a funny guy himself, and he's obviously just been submitted by Gene Silver, so he's going to have to stay away from the rankings. He's going to need a bit of a step down, in my opinion, for Bryce Mitchell, and I think Chepe Mariscal's the perfect fight. I think it'll be a banger. Chepe Mariscal, very well-rounded, fun guy. Bryce Mitchell, you know his style is to kind of have a high output style on the feet and then take it down to the mat. And I also think, imagine the press conference. An Australian crowd mixed with Bryce Mitchell is the recipe for a perfect press conference and a perfect build-up. So Bryce Mitchell's comeback fight, step down in competition against undefeated in the UFC Chepe Mariscal, I think would be a good fight to build the name of Mariscal or get Bryce Mitchell back in the winning column. Obviously no Australian fighters in this fight, but I think it's just a good main card fight to open up the main card of UFC 319. And then we get into business with Steve Erceg, one of Australia's biggest fighters in the last 12 months, not physically, but in the, you know, the size of the fights that he's been in. And I feel like one of the best fights you can do at flyweight right now would be Steve Erceg against Joshua Van. This is, in my opinion, one of the best fights you can do. This would be one of the highest level boxing fights you see in the flyweight division. Obviously, Steve Erceg's now on a 3-fight losing streak. He needs to stop getting fights at the top. He's kind of like Paulo Costa, who he keeps getting fights against fighters at the top of this division. Steve Erceg needs to get a step down in competition, but he's still one of the best boxers in this division. That knockout over Max Schnell, the competitive striking matches he had with Alejandro Pantoja Moreno, two of some of the best in this division. It's no doubt that Steve Erceg is one of the most technically sound boxers in this division, and the only guy I can really compare to him is Joshua Van. I'd argue that Joshua Van's an even better fighter, not fighter, but striker than Steve Erceg. His rips to the body, his combinations, his boxing is so slick in this division. Apart from that knockout loss to Charles Johnson, he's just been bullying people with his hands. He's got some of the best hands in this division. I'm interested to see the size comparison as well, because Steve Erceg's naturally a big flyweight and Joshua Van's tiny, even for the 125-pound division. But regardless, if you want to see one of the highest level boxing fights you can see in the UFC, one of the best scraps in the flyweight division, I think Steve Erceg getting a step down in competition against Joshua Van, who's a bit of a flyweight prospect, is the perfect fight to put on a main card for Steve Erceg. Last time he fought in Australia, he got knocked the fuck out by Kai Kara-France, so we're not going to put him in there against a heavy knockout machine, but we are going to put him in there against a competitive stand-up fighter in Joshua Van. And if Joshua Van can beat Steve Erceg, he's just got his biggest win yet. He's beat a guy who's been making it competitive with the top dogs. That's a massive win for Joshua Van. And if Steve Erceg wins, he's back in the winning column, he's broken the losing streak, and he's got a win in front of the Australian. So Steve Erceg, Joshua Van for the next fight up on the main card. And then for the featured fight, it's getting serious now, as Arman Tsarukyan is going to be taking on Dan Hooker. Let's just do this fight for Australia. Dan Hooker versus Arman Tsarukyan. One of the main reasons I want to see this fight isn't even for the fight itself, but it's for the build-up. Both of these guys have been taking jabs at each other online for like the past 2 years, honestly. They've got a bit of a rivalry going on at 155. And even though you can argue that Tsarukyan deserves a bigger matchup than Dan Hooker, Hooker's on a winning streak. Tsarukyan's already been promised that he's not going to be getting the next title fight, and I think the build-up itself would be massive for the 155-pound division. So I would book Tsarukyan versus Dan Hooker, and I'd probably do it as a title eliminator too, and I think it makes sense because there isn't really any much options for the two of them right now. If you look at the top 6 of the lightweight division, you've got to cross out Holloway and Poirier because they're fighting at UFC 318. You cross out Oliveira because they're going to be taking on Ilia Topuria, and you've got Dan Hooker, Gaethje, and Tsarukyan, and considering that Dan Hooker was already supposed to fight Gaethje's won since then, I think Tsarukyan versus Dan Hooker, a bit of a rivalry right now in the lightweight division to put on Australia, would be an amazing fight. A title eliminator too, where the winner gets a title fight. And even though I'm confident that Tsarukyan would get this job done, it means something for the division. If Tsarukyan does beat Dan Hooker, that secures himself a title fight against either Ilia Topuria or Charles Oliveira. And if Dan Hooker can beat Arman Tsarukyan, he's just got his biggest win yet, his biggest career win yet in front of Australia, and he's also earned himself a title fight. So Tsarukyan versus Dan Hooker, I think this would be an absolute banger for the 155-pound division. And I think the build-up would be insane too. Tsarukyan, Hooker, title eliminator at 155. But now he's getting serious with the co-main event. It's Alexander Volkanovski, arguably the biggest Australian fighter. Again, not so much in size, but in terms of popularity. And I think there's only one fight that kind of makes sense for him right now, and it is Movsar Evloev. I said earlier on in the card that there's going to be a bit of a theme of Australians versus Dagestanis on this card, and this is one of them. Volkanovski versus Movsar Evloev, it makes sense. You can't do an Australian pay-per-view and not have Alexander Volkanovski there. He is the face of Australian MMA, so you've got to have him on the Australian card as the co-main event. He's obviously just won the belt back against Diego Lopez, and it's time for Volkanovski's second title reign. Don't waste this opportunity. Get him in Australia as soon as possible. And it has to be against Movsar Evloev. He's undefeated in the UFC on a huge winning streak. He's the only real contender that stands out. So get this fight done. Volkanovski versus Evloev. And I do think that Volkanovski could win this fight. And it means something again for the division, because he's going to be obviously defending his belt again. And he's doing it in front of Australia. So Volkanovski, it's like history all over again. Facing another Dagestani fighter in front of Australia. I think it's a winnable fight for Volkanovski against the only other contender. Get him in Australia, get him against Movsar Evloev, and his first title defense on this new reign. Volkanovski, Evloev for the co-main event of UFC 319 in Australia. Even Volkanovski as a co-main event just shows how stacked the main card is, because the main event, I think you already know what the main event's going to be. Jack de la Maddalena, the newly crowned welterweight champion, against Islam Makhachev. Arguably the biggest fight outside of Jones and Aspinall you can make in the UFC right now. I know there's going to be a few people bummed out because we're not going to see Makhachev versus Topuria, but I still am a massive fan of JDM versus Makhachev. Obviously, JDM just won the belt over Bilal Muhammad. He's on a 19-fight winning streak now in MMA, as he takes on pound-for-pound #1 lightweight defending champion Islam Makhachev in a super fight. This is the obvious fight to make next. Like I said before, it'd be one of the biggest fights you can make in MMA right now. And I think it's a 50-50 fight. I see half the people saying that Makhachev destroys him. I disagree. Moving up a weight class against a bigger JDM, who's shown in this fight against Bilal Muhammad that he's a good anti-grappler, durable for 5 rounds, and have some of the slickest boxing in the UFC. That's an awful stylistic matchup for Islam Makhachev. And I actually think I prefer this fight to the fight with Volkanovski. Fair enough, Volkanovski had a bigger profile at the time of fighting Makhachev, but stylistically, because of how not dangerous, but how, tough of a matchup this is for Makhachev, I think JDM versus Makhachev is probably a better fight than Volkanovski Makhachev too. So JDM versus Makhachev's chance at double champ status, which he has earned at this point. JDM getting a chance to beat pound for pound #1 and get revenge on Islam Makhachev for beating Alexander Volkanovski last time he fought in Australia. Again, the rivalry between Australia and Dagestan continues. JDM, Islam Makhachev to main event a pay-per-view in Perth later this year. If they are going to do this fight, which it has to be next, you've got to do it in Perth. I mean, JDM's been asking for a Perth slot for years now. Get him in Perth. Get him against Makhachev. Make the biggest fight of 2025 if they ain't going to do Jones and Aspinall. And that would be my UFC Perth card builder. Let me know your thoughts on this card. I think I've kept it realistic whilst also trying to stack the card. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.